Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on building custom RAG chatbots with Fireway and Tonic Validate. I'm your host, Chiara Colombi. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Tonic AI, and I am very happy to be joined by two trailblazers in the generative AI and RAG application space. We have Mark Mercado, the CEO and co-founder of popular data generation platform Mockaroo, and also founder of his latest endeavor, Fireaway. And from Tonic, we have our very own senior AI scientist, Joe Ferrara, who is a key member of our AI and data science team. If you've joined one of our webinars before, you may already be familiar with our data generation platforms, but I'm going to give you a very, very quick recap. Mockaroo offers a rules-based data synthesis platform for generating data from scratch when you don't have any data to work with and you need something to populate your lower environments. Well, Tonic, meanwhile, offers a data synthesis platform for generating synthetic data from existing data. So it enables you to transform sensitive production data into safe-to-use, de-identified data for testing and development. So we're long-standing data synthesis providers, and we can both say that we've been doing generative AI since way before it was cool. And as coincidence would have it, with the recent surge in Gen AI, we both began to dig into a particular area that led us to building the solutions we're going to introduce you to today. And that area is Retrieval Augmented Generation, aka RAG. Before I hand it over to the experts to go into more detail, please know that we welcome your questions at any time. You can ask them in the Q&A area of Zoom, and I'll make sure we get them answered. All right, Mark, over to you.
All right, thank you, Chiara. Let me share my screen and let's get started. So, welcome one and all. I'm Mark Mercado, creator of Mockaroo, and also most recently Fireaway. Let's dive in. So last year, ChatGPT basically took the world by storm. And so unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably at least tried ChatGPT, and you might have run into one of its limitations, which is, imagine you asked it a question like this: can you tell me the process for resetting my password at my company? ChatGPT has a lot of these boilerplate answers where it's like, as an AI assistant, I can't help you. And basically that's because ChatGPT can only answer questions on public data. It doesn't know anything about, data that hasn't been shared with it. So RAG can come to the rescue. RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, and it allows LLMs, or large language models like ChatGPT, to answer questions using private data and documents. But because of the limitations of LLMs, and particularly the implementations that are out there like ChatGPT, there are lots of parameters that developers must consider when developing a RAG solution. This is basically how RAG works at a basic level. It retrieves documents from a database that are relevant for your question and then injects them into your question before that question is sent to ChatGPT. So from ChatGPT's perspective, this is what the conversation looks like. Here's our IT guidebook, which I'm too darn lazy to read. Paste the entire IT guidebook here. Now, can you tell me the process for resetting my password? And then ChatGPT says, I read your incredibly long question. The question answers itself, dummy. Here's your answer. So that's how RAG works. You basically retrieve a bunch of context, you stuff it into the prompt, and then ChatGPT now all of a sudden knows about private data. So underneath the hood, this is actually what's happening. Without RAG, your question just goes directly to the LLM. But with RAG, your question first gets converted into what's called an embedding vector. And that vector can be compared against all of the private documents in your vector database or document repository to figure out which are the most relevant documents to that question. Basically, like at a basic level, what documents are just similar to that question. A vector is just like a giant array of numbers that's like categorizing your question along a bunch of different dimensions. And so we use a vector database to pull back the most relevant documents, and then we inject those into your question so that the LLM can read that and answer it like on the fly. Context, however, has limitations, particularly in length. Context is measured in tokens. A token is about 3 to 4 characters. The different models have different max context lengths. They're getting larger, but even if you could fit like your entire encyclopedia of knowledge into the context, it takes time for ChatGPT to actually read your entire message, including your entire encyclopedia of content. And so responses will be slower and they'll be a lot more expensive because you're charged by the token. So the way that we try to maximize the value of the context while keeping it small enough to fit within the limits is by a process called chunking, which is basically given a document, extract the text from it, divide that text into chunks, maybe like by sentences or by paragraphs or by sections, generate these embedding vectors for each chunk, store each chunk in the vector database along with that vector. And then when the user asks their question, you generate an embedding vector using the exact same process on their question. And then you just do a vector analysis, which basically says like, give me the chunks ordered by the similarity to my question. And then you take as many of those as you can and use those as the context based on the context length. So there are other parameters as well besides length. There's how to determine the boundaries of the chunks. So like by sentence, by paragraph, do I inject metadata into each chunk? By section, should chunks overlap? Meaning like take the last sentence from the previous paragraph and add it to the current paragraph and so on. So that there's like just better context. They all have their trade-offs. Diving into one of them, chunk length. Basically, you want to divide a document into small enough chunks to preserve meaning and context. So smaller chunks would yield faster answers and maybe jam more relevant info into the prompt for the LLM, but larger chunks contain more context about each paragraph. So to make it more concrete, answering the question that we had about resetting passwords using a small chunking strategy, maybe you have two chunks in your database. Chunk one, to reset your password, fill out this form. And then maybe the next sentence in the document was, requests will only be processed during normal business hours. Now, if the question was about password reset, you can do your own vector analysis. This is similar, has the same words, but this is not similar at all. Maybe this is totally irrelevant. So if these two things don't have any attached context, like this is just totally not relevant. So all the LLM sees is this information, and it won't be able to tell you that, hey, requests are only processed during normal business hours. If you use a larger chunking strategy, all that might go in the same chunk, and so the LLM can decide whether or not it's appropriate to include this, expanded part of the answer. But of course, large chunking strategy isn't always the right answer either. So maybe there are two types of password reset forms, one of them for the benefits portal and one of them for the main corporate site. And so if you have large enough chunks, maybe they're both relevant, but in using this chunk, we ran out of context length to also be able to inject this chunk. And so maybe the actual answer that you're looking for is this. The LLM, if it had both chunks, could be like, well, if you're looking for the main site, reset here. If you're looking for benefits, reset here. But it only knows about this because we used a large chunking strategy. So it's a trade-off. There's a bunch of other RAG parameters as well. So besides content length and chunking strategy, there's the actual embedding model that you use. There's GPT 3.5 or 4 or either other providers. That's the chat model. In addition to that, the actual embedding model. So what models do you use to generate the vectors? What algorithm do you actually use for vector comparison? The system prompt, which establishes the AI persona and kind of gives it guidance on how to answer. The user prompt, because the AI often ignores the system prompt and really pays attention to the user prompt. So injecting more things other than just the context in the user's question. And then the temperature, like how creative can the AI assistant be? Do you want it writing poetry and being as expansive as possible, or is it doing like math and it needs to be exactly right or the world falls apart? And there's a bunch of additional challenges as well, which is like, how do I even like discover and index all the documents that I want my AI to be able to answer on? Assuming I found all of them, how do I keep all of them up to date? Who has access to what information? If I'm building a RAG system for like a corporation, there's a lot of stuff in our corporations that's on a need-to-know basis. So keeping that access control alive in the AM is a very difficult problem. As a conversation grows, if you're building conversational AI, the context limit kind of shrinks because you want to be able to feed the entire conversation up to now into the AI. So dealing with that shrinking context is difficult. How do you handle follow-up questions that don't have any context? Like imagine somebody asks a very precise question about how do I reset my password? And then the next question is literally just, can I do this over the phone? Well, what is this in that context? All of this costs money. Depending on what model you use, it can cost a lot of money. How big your context is can cost you money. So how much is this all costing me? Basically, like to boil it all down, if I change any one of these parameters, how does that affect user experience? How can I measure that? So before we get into Tonic's solution to that very problem, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Fireway. Fireway is basically RAG as a service. And the idea is you put a custom AI assistant on your website, trained on your data, or you can just log into Fireway and ask it questions about your data. So here's a brief demo. Many of you probably know Mockaroo. If you go to Mockaroo and you click the little assistant down here, this is using Fireway as it's meant to be used. So you can go and ask it a question about Mockaroo and it'll come up with a helpful answer. So let me actually ask one that I got the other day in email form that they could have asked using the assistant, which was like, how can I get around the 5,000 record limit when using the API? Okay, so there's this background equals true parameter that you can use that will spin up a background test to generate larger than 5,000 records using the API. You could switch context midstream if you wanted to. You wanted to be like, how can I create an email field that's based on first and last name fields? So it'll tell you to use a formula, and here's the actual code for that formula. And so how did it learn all this stuff? Basically, there's documentation within Mockaroo like there would be in any site. And I went into Fireway and I created a new AI chatbot. And I basically pointed it to Mockaroo.com. It crawled Mockaroo.com. It found all the documents. It indexed them. It put them in a vector database. And it produces this customized chatbot just for Mockaroo. So you can see that actually that chatbot is here. And I could go and ask those questions directly in Fireway if I wanted to, if I didn't have a website to post this on. Or you can go to publish and take this script tag and put it on your website, and now you have AI assistance. So diving under the hood a little bit, what it actually did, I gave it one source, which is Mockaroo.com. Here's all the pages that it crawled. You can even see in some of them, like this was the content that it extracted. It extracted one chunk out of that. If there were more chunks, you'd see them here. So it gives you a little bit of window into the inner workings of a RAG system. And then here are some of the parameters that you can tweak. So like here's the prompt when you open the chatbot. Here's the model, here's the context length, here's the system prompt, there's the temperature that I was talking about, there's the user prompt, including where the context gets injected, whether or not you want to include citations or enable mathematical calculations. Those are just some of the parameters that you could tweak in an overall RAG system. So if you're interested in getting ChatGPT-like answers to things that ChatGPT can't see, try Fireway. It's free to try, and if you actually wind up putting it on your website, then you have to upgrade to a paid tier. But it can be quite helpful even in the free tier. Go back to my slides.
Got a question for you. Can it be connected to something like Notion so you can have it have access to either your company's Notion or maybe you have a personal Notion and you can't keep track of your travel plans or something? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So right now, you can upload documents, and of course, those documents could be completely private, or you can crawl public websites. I have to build into it, I have not done yet, a way to authenticate against a private website, like a Notion, if you had to log into it. Don't have that yet. But right now, you could take all that as a markdown dump or something and upload it into Fireway. Or if it's like a publicly crawlable thing, then you can crawl it just using Fireway.
Awesome. We have another question that just came in. Can it be crawled over Salesforce org?
That's a good question. I would imagine you have to sign into, are you talking about your own private Salesforce or Salesforce's documentation? If it's your own private Salesforce, it can't do that quite yet. Although that's the thing I should literally go and build right now to be able to crawl through private stuff. If you're interested in reaching out to me and doing a pilot on that, I'd be interested in trying that with you, because I think we could probably provide some really amazing answers on internal content. And I do envision Fireway also having a on-prem installation to where this would only go to your own servers. I would have no access to it, just like Makaru does. So it would be, a highly secure environment.
Yeah, that question answer did follow up to say private Salesforce cloud. So maybe that's somebody to connect with.
Got it. Yeah. So it would have to log in and authenticate. Yeah. If you want to shoot me a message, offline, Kiara, maybe you can put my contact details in the chat. I'd
Sure.
be interested in exploring that more. Cool. Thanks for the question.
And I do have another question. Is now a good time to keep going with questions?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
RAG best practices. How mature are the guidelines? Where does it make sense to use Fireway, and where does it make sense to do it yourself? And like along with that, where do we find RAG best practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually a great setup for one of my slides here, which is there are building blocks for this stuff. Particularly a great place to start is frameworks, just like building any application. There are two prominent frameworks in the RAG space, Llama Index and LangChain. And they have kind of all the current best practices encoded into those frameworks as like a million variables you can change. So I would look to either of those. In fact, I did when building Fireway, just like look at what they're doing with respect to like overlap and chunk length and how to split up various different document types. Like if you know something's markdown, you can use a very different strategy than if you know it's like PDF. PDF has pages and metadata, Markdown has sections and headings. So my biggest advice there is just actually go and look at Llama Index or LangChain, look at the source control, look at the discussion around it, and you'll learn a lot about the best practices and whether or not you want to try to use something off the shelf or build something yourself with one of those frameworks.
Well, we got more questions. I'll save them for later, though. That way you can.
Okay. So just tying up Fireway, Fireway does a lot of these things for you. It can find documents, it can extract the text, it has intelligent chunking strategies based on a syntactic understanding of different document types. I didn't show it, but it can link to references in the original material. So it can basically say, for more information, check here and then point you to the docs. You can configure the context length. It does streaming responses, both in the web interface and also through an API that you can call, so you can build your own interface on top of it. It preserves that conversational context. So if the first question has a ton of context to it and the second question is just a follow-up, it understands that lineage. All interactions, including the cost for each, are logged and are visible to admins. So if you're tuning the usage cost, you can see that very transparency for each question and answer. And users can also provide feedback by uploading and downvoting answers. I mentioned the building blocks. If you're building your own RAG system, during the life of maintaining the system, here's some of the things you'll encounter. Model drift. So if one day OpenAI changes model weights and the model just behaves differently, it can seem like it's getting dumber. It can seem like it's getting more verbose. That's just going to happen, and it's a black box to you. If you change any RAG parameter, it's like chaos theory, like a butterfly flaps its wings in one part of the world and answers start changing in another part of the world. And trying to wrap your arms around that is frustrating. When documents change, it's essentially the same, chaotic environment. Like one little change of a document throws off everything, and all of a sudden there's an entire cohort of people that can't get their questions answered. So like when any of this stuff changes, how do you know if your user experience will get worse or better before you deploy those changes? Will any change result in more or less relevant answers? And that's a great segue to Tonic Validate. Tonic Validate is basically Tonic's solution for actually quantifying whether a RAG system is getting better or worse. So I'll let the expert talk about it. Joe, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Let me share my screen here real quick. Cool. Sweet. Yeah, thanks, Mark. So just to build off what Mark was saying, the Tonic Validate is really great for, Tonic Validate is a RAG evaluation platform. It's great for figuring out if you're building a RAG system, when you're changing the many different parameters that Mark talked about, how does that affect the quality of responses, and what's the best way, what's the best parameters to use? So as I explain Tonic Validate, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to explain what Tonic Validate is, and then I'm going to do two demos. The first demo will be a super stripped down demo that shows the mechanics of how Tonic Validate works. And then the second demo will be a beefed up example that shows how Tonic Validate can bring value to you when you're building a RAG system. So Tonic Validate came out of a project we were doing at Tonic, where we were building an internal RAG chatbot to allow employees to ask questions about our Notion documents. And so like many people and businesses that got started with RAG, we were super excited and put out like a really big engineering effort. We figured out the data we were going to use, our chunking strategy, we got the data in a vector database, we figured out our retrieval strategy, and what LLM we'd use in the RAG system. Once we put it all together, we started asking questions, and we saw that the answers to those questions were not great. So we needed a good way to improve the response quality of our RAG chatbot. And as Mark showed, there's many knobs you can turn in a RAG system to change how it works. And so we wanted to make sure that as we turn different knobs, we were actually improving the responses and end up with like the best RAG system possible. So Tonic Validate came out as a way to do that evaluation and track how changes in the RAG system contributed to changes in the RAG responses that made the responses better. So to do that, I need to talk about how do you evaluate a RAG system. So this is a really simple recipe for doing that. And anybody could come up with this recipe for evaluating a RAG system if they thought about it for about 5 minutes. But the hard part is actually implementing a system to carry this out. And that's where Tonic Validate comes in. So how do you evaluate a RAG system? The first thing you need to do is build a benchmark set of questions and reference correct answers to test your RAG system with. These are example questions that you want your RAG system to do well at answering. The second step is have RAG metrics that produce numeric scores for the questions in your benchmark set. Now, this is a non-trivial task because the responses of a RAG system are free text. The correct answers in your benchmark set are free text, and the retrieved context that you want to measure how good is my retrieval system is also free text. So you have to have a way to take all that free text and come up with numeric scores. Once you have your benchmark test set and your RAG metrics, then you're off to the races. You can iterate on your RAG parameters, the infrastructure of your RAG system, and the data you're using for your RAG system. And then you can compare the performance across different experiments to improve the scores of the RAG metrics. So let's see how Tonic Validate will help you carry out these steps. So Tonic Validate has 3 main components. The first one is it has evaluation metrics to measure and monitor the performance of your RAG system. These evaluation metrics use something called LLM-assisted evaluation. So that's when you use a large language model to score the responses from your RAG system. So a simple example would be, let's say you have a question from your benchmark set, you have the reference correct answer, and you ask that question to your RAG chatbot, and you get your RAG answer. You want to see how good this answer is. So you take the RAG answer and the reference correct answer, you prompt GPT-4 and ask GPT-4, on a scale from 0 to 5, how well does this response match this correct answer? And then GPT-4 will give you a number that you can use as a metric to measure how good that response is. So the second component of Tonic Validate is the web application, which we have a screenshot of over here on the right. The web application allows you to visualize metrics that you're using to score your RAG system and then track, compare, and iterate on experiments. So for each experiment, you have metrics for that experiment, and then you can see how they change over time in the Tonic Validate UI. The third component of Tonic Validate is a Python SDK, which brings together the first 2 components. The Python SDK has the code for calculating the metrics and logging them to the web application. The Python SDK lives where you may be building your RAG system if you're doing it in Python, and it's super easy to use, as you'll see in the demo. Okay, and last slide before I get to the demos, I want to talk about 3 of the metrics in Tonic Validate. So Tonic Validate has more than these 3 metrics, but these are the ones I'll use in the demos. So the 3 metrics are answer similarity, retrieval precision, and augmentation precision. Answer similarity is the similarity of the RAG response to the reference correct answer on a scale of 0 to 5. This is the metric I explained when I was talking about what LLM-assisted evaluation is. It's an end-to-end metric that you use to measure how well your RAG system is doing as a whole. The other 2 metrics, retrieval precision and augmentation precision, are about measuring how is the context used that's retrieved to answer questions. So retrieval precision tells you of the retrieved context, what percentage of it is relevant to actually answer the question. This metric measures your retrieval system, so your chunking strategy, your embedder, and your ranking algorithm for ranking the retrieved chunks. And then augmentation precision tells you of the relevant context what ended up in the answer. So retrieval precision tells you what context is relevant, and augmentation precision measures the percentage of that ends up in the answer. Augmentation precision tells you how good is the LLM in your RAG system at recognizing relevant context and then putting that into the answer. Okay, so I'll pause here for a second before I jump into the demos. If there's any questions I can answer.
Yeah, there are a bunch of questions, and I think they might also inform your demo. I think some of these are also for Fireway and Mark, so feel free to both chime in with answers. First question is, how private could this be? Meaning us as creators of this tool, are we going to be able to see what the end user is ingesting into the chatbot? And another audience member chimed in, recommending that the system might need to be built into a private cloud using like AWS.
Yeah, so that's a correct answer. Yeah, if you're using Fireway, like the hosted version of Fireway on the internet, you're uploading the data into my database. While I don't actually go and look at it, I have no reason to. Like, that should be a valid fear on your end. But like I said, Fireway also has a enterprise version where I wouldn't have any access to it. You would just set up Postgres on your cloud, like RDS or something, AWS, or even on-prem, and then run the application on a EC2 server or something like that. And it would only be people who have access to that AWS environment who have a login to your Fireway, which you could put behind a VPN, to really lock it down.
Joe, did you want to speak to privacy as well?
Yeah, I mean, so like privacy is always for a RAG system. There's, if you build it or if you're using Fireway, there's the different amount of privacy, and then there's also like a big aspect of privacy is what LLM are you using? So if you're using, like one of OpenAI's LLMs, then the questions and the context are gonna go there. Maybe you have Azure, so you're not worried about that. And you can also like, use one of the open source LLMs and put that on your premise. So then you wouldn't have to worry about the questions and the context going to a third party when the prompt is sent to the LLM to get the answer.
Awesome.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Just to add to that, like Fireway also can use the Azure version of OpenAI. And I looked into this, like if you actually read what Microsoft says about data privacy, yes, the data has to get sent to their servers because it's a very expensive model to run, but they pledge, for whatever you believe it or not, that they don't use that data. If you use Azure OpenAI, they won't use that data as part of any training, or no other customer would have access to that. So I imagine they will plan on making a lot of money off of that promise. So that's the hope. And so if you buy Fireway Enterprise, then you could hook it up to Azure OpenAI.
Joe, do you have something you wanted to add, or should I jump to the next two questions?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Cool. Next question is, and I think this was for Fireway, can it change a response based on feedback? Like, given the same question is usually asked by multiple users, would it know to not give an answer that has been downvoted most times?
It doesn't yet. That sounds like a great idea in theory. One of the reasons why I haven't done that is it does allow for some interesting poisoning of the responses. Like if you upvote bad answers or downvote good answers, how to weight that against the normal, kind of RAG patterns is not something I've explored yet. So I just haven't gone there. The only ramification to feedback is that as an admin, you can log in and see the feedback and then change parameters to try to solve for that case. And if you use Tonic Validate, you could probably incorporate answers that are been given feedback on into your test cases to actually measure in some quantifiable way whether or not changes are making them better or worse.
Cool. Another question for you, Mark. How would this work against tabular data? Say I have a CSV in hand that I know contains answers to my questions. Could I provide that as context in my prompt to get a natural language answer to my question? How does chunking enter the picture here?
There be a lot of dragons. Okay, the first rule of LLMs is they don't do math. The second rule is that they don't do math. Like, it is such a fool's errand to try to get ChatGPT to do math of any kind. My wife's studying for her MBA. She banged her head against this a lot of time trying to get ChatGPT to help with homework. Sometimes it might seem like it can do it, but oftentimes it actually can't. So if your question is at all mathematical, it's probably going to come up with some strange hallucination and be wildly off. So I don't recommend, doing that kind of like, I'm going to upload a database of like numbers and have it solve a problem. You can ask it like, tell me what the equation is to solve this problem and learn about the theory, but having it actually do the math is fraught with problems.
But what if it was, free text in a tabular format,
Yeah,
question
then
there.
it's fine. Now, Fireway doesn't have a particular chunking approach for CSV because it's probably just not one of the more common patterns. Like I have like great support for PDFs, for web pages, which I basically convert to Markdown and then like use the semantics of Markdown to chunk based on sections. And then obviously Markdown directly, images, like Word documents, PowerPoint, all those things, but nothing specific for CSV. So it's just going to treat it as text and split it, based on some finite chunk length in the text.
Okay, cool. I'm going to go with one more question, and then Joe, I'll pass it back to you for the demo. Joe, this question is for you. Do you have a video explaining how tonic metrics work that is shareable? Can you re-explain how the metrics provided by tonic relate to decisions on what to improve in an LLM? One thing I will quickly just chime in is this webinar is being recorded, and this will be shareable afterwards. We'll send out the recording. But Joe, if you have more to add.
Yeah, I don't have a video explaining all the metrics. I should definitely make one, but I'll put in the chat the GitHub for Tonic Validate. So I hope that went through. Kara,
if you're in the chat, you might have to.
I answered the question, but anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that if you go to Tonic Validate's GitHub, so if you put in tonic_validate into GitHub, the GitHub has a bunch of documentation about exactly what the metrics mean and how they work. So the GitHub also links to our documentation, which should be able to answer those questions. And the second question I think was, how do you know how do you tell how things affect the LLM? Something along those lines, right?
How the metrics provided by Tonic relate to decisions on what to improve in an LLM.
Yeah, so that will be clear when I do these demos. So let's jump into that.
Awesome.
Cool. So for the first demo, I'm just going to show you how Tonic Validate works. So I'm going to jump into Fireway here, and I have these chatbots. And so the first demo, I'll use this university chatbot. So this is a super simple chatbot that its source is one PDF, which is the PDF export of the university Wikipedia page. And so I'm going to interact with this chatbot in Python through this Jupyter notebook. So I have a Fireway professional account, so I can interact with the chatbot using the Fireway API. And then I'm going to get some responses to questions and log them into Tonic Validate. So let me show the Tonic Validate UI and show how we can get started with that. So this is the Tonic Validate UI. There's three things in the UI. There's projects, benchmarks, and runs. Benchmarks are what I've been talking about. They're a set of questions and reference correct answers. You could also have a benchmark set of only questions if you haven't made reference correct answers. And if you have a benchmark set of only questions, then you would just use the metrics that don't need the reference correct answer in them. A project in Tonic Validate corresponds to one RAG system that you're developing. And then a run in Tonic Validate corresponds to one experiment for that RAG system, where you run through the questions in the benchmark set, you get the scores of the responses, and then you log them to Tonic Validate. So let's see what we have to do to get started in Tonic Validate. So first thing we need to do is create an API key. So I'll call it my demo API key. This will allow me to log things to the Tonic Validate UI, then copy that to use in the Jupyter notebook. And the second thing I'm going to do is create a project, a so-called demo project. So I'm going to copy the project ID to allow me to log a run to this project. Now let's jump into this Jupyter notebook and start running these cells. It's always dangerous to run cells live, but let's see how this goes. This cell with all this code here is this code for interacting with the Fireway API. And now I'm going to ask that Fireway chatbot a couple of questions. So I'm going to run these cells. So I'm using questions from something called the Squad V2 dataset, which is a great open source dataset that has 150,000 questions about Wikipedia pages, and it has reference correct answers. For this quick demo, I'm going to use two questions, which I put into a benchmark here. I have these two questions about the university Wikipedia page. Now in this cell, I asked the questions to the Fireway chatbot, and we got the answers out down here. So let's look at the questions, the answers real quick. We see that the answer to the first question is 143. That came out in the, from Fireway. And the answer to the second question is 1963. That also came out from Fireway. The only difference between the responses is Fireway's responses were more verbose. And this is a well-known thing about LLMs, is that they love being verbose. Now let's look at the retrieved context for the first question. So I printed it out here. It's not that interesting to look at. It's basically like walls of text. And here we see that the chunks are separated by this, and there's many chunks here. So let's look at how many chunks there are. There's 11 chunks. And now in this cell, I'm going to score the responses and the retrieved context using Tonic Validate. So let's see how that works. So I import the validate score from Tonic Validate. Then I import the 3 metrics that I'm interested in using. And it's super simple to instantiate the score. By default, the validate score will use GPT-4 Turbo as the LLM that's going to do the LLM assisted evaluation. You can also change this with an optional parameter. And then here I score the responses and score the retrieved context. And this takes a second to run because it's prompting GPT-4 with the responses and the retrieved context and getting the scores. Now we see it finished running there. So let's look at the scores that we got. Cool. So we have answer similarity score, retrieval precision, and augmentation precision. Answer similarity is 5 for both of the answers, which is great because we saw that the answers Fireway gave had the same meaning as the reference correct answers. And we see that retrieval precision and augmentation precision are percentages of the retrieved context that's relevant, or of the relevant context that ended up in the answer. Now let's upload these scores to Tonic Validate. So to do that, I'm going to execute this cell. This is where I need to input the API key that I got earlier and the project ID. Okay, so I'm going to execute this cell, and it finished. Now let's see what happened in Tonic Validate. So we go back to the UI here. I'm going to click on this demo project. This is the project page. We see that there's one run down here. So I just did a run where I uploaded those responses and those scores. If I click on this run here, then on this page, I can see on the right-hand side are the questions, the reference answer, and the LLM response. So that's a response from the RAG system. Then I have the retrieved context here, which I can inspect, collapse it, and then also the scores for that response. The overall score here is the average of these 3 scores after answer similarity has been divided by 5. So we get an overall score between 0 and 1. Then on the left-hand side here, I have histograms of the scores that were logged during the run. So for instance, you can see an answer similarity, 2 responses were scored, and they both got an answer similarity score of 5. Okay, so that's a super simple example that just shows you how, like, the mechanics of Tonic Validate, how do you use it? Let's look at a little bit more beefed up example that would be more similar to what you would be doing while you're developing your RAG system. So for this more complex example, I'm going to jump into a different chatbot here and go to this university's chatbot. In this case, instead of only have one PDF, I have 11 PDFs here, 10 different university pages exported, Wikipedia pages exported as PDFs, and then also the university page. In your case, you might have hundreds or thousands of PDFs, or you might have crawled the website where you end up with like hundreds of web pages in the crawl. In this case, I'm using these 11 PDFs. All right, and so now I'm going to work in this Jupyter Notebook. I'm not going to be running this Jupyter Notebook live because it takes a little bit more time, but the code's basically the same as the previous Jupyter Notebook. I'm just going to do, there's 2 main differences. I can do multiple runs with different parameters. And then the questions I'm going to ask, I can have more than 2 questions. So here we can see I'm loading up 20 questions into a benchmark to score and log to Tonic Validate instead of just 2. In your case, you might have hundreds of questions for your benchmark, or you may even have thousands. So real quick, let's jump back in Fireway and see what we can change. So Mark showed this, but the parameters we can change for the RAG system are the model. There are 2 options there. The max context tokens. The max context tokens controls how many chunks are retrieved to put into as the retrieved context. We can change the user prompt, the system prompt, and the temperature. So let's see what happens when we change some of these. Oops, on this notebook. Okay, so for the first run, I'm going to use GPT 3.5 Turbo, max context tokens of 2000 in the default user prompt. We jump into Tonic Validate. I already ran that notebook. We'll be looking at this university chatbot project. So if I click on this, we have 5 runs here. Let's look at that first run with those parameters. So in this run here, we see it's a little bit more interesting than the previous time because there's more questions, so the histograms are more interesting. I have the questions and the answers and the scores on the right as before. And then I have the histograms for each score. We can see that answer similarity score, there are 5 questions, they got an answer similarity score of 0. So let's see how we can change the parameters to improve the answer similarity score. So if I go back to the notebook, I'll go through how I change the parameters, and then I'll show in Tonic Validate how the scores change. So for the second run, I'm going to use GPT 3.5 Turbo again, but now up the max context tokens to 10,000. So in this run, there'll be more retrieved context. Then in the third run, I'll use GPT-4 as the model, but then drop the max context tokens back down to 2,000. So there'll be less retrieved context, but a better LLM. For the fourth run, I'll then up the max context tokens back up to 10,000 using GPT-4. And then for the fifth run, I'll try changing the user prompt. So you may have noticed that in the Squad V2 dataset, the answers were very short, whereas the answers from Fireway were more verbose. So let's see, I'm wondering here, if I change the user prompt to ask it to be more precise, will that make the answers better? You can see in Fireway here, I have that user prompt down here. So I'm asking, reply with a concise response that answers the questions without any additional information. It's not necessary to respond with a full sentence if, for instance, the answer to the question can be given in a word. Okay, now let's jump into Tonic Validate and see what happened with the scores. So on this page here, we have this plot that shows on the x-axis the runs, and then on the y-axis the average score over the questions in the benchmark for that run. And then let's look at answer similarity. So the first one, we got an average answer similarity score 3.35. The second one, we got an average answer similarity score 4.2. And that's when we upped the max context tokens from 2,000 to 10,000. So retrieving more context got us a better answer similarity score. Let's see what happened with retrieval precision and augmentation precision. So for retrieval precision, the score went down. So this makes sense, as if we retrieve more context, then less of it's going to be relevant on average. And then for augmentation precision, the score actually went up. Why would that happen? So if we retrieve more context, then we're more likely to get the most relevant context. So then of the relevant context, the most relevant context is more likely to end up in the answer, and that can raise the augmentation precision score. So as you can see here, you may not want to max out both retrieval precision and augmentation precision because they may have an inverse relationship. When you're tuning your RAG model and choosing the best parameters, you want to max out the answer similarity score because that's the end-to-end metric. Retrieval precision and augmentation precision are more metrics that help you understand how your RAG system is working. Okay, so let's check out what happened with answer similarity score on the other runs. When we switched from GPT 3.5 to GPT-4, the answer similarity score went up a little bit. So that confirms what we all know, that GPT-4 is better than GPT 3.5. And then for the fourth run, when we upped the max context tokens back up to 10,000, the score got even higher. Then the last run, my conjecture that changing the user prompt would give a better answer did not actually help the score went down a little bit. So that shows that, the fourth run had the best parameters. And so then those would be like, that would show us, how do we change the parameters? How did the score change? And then we want to use the parameters that gave us the best score. Cool. So that is the end of the demo. I hope that shows you how you can use Tonic Validate to improve your RAG system and figure out the best parameters to use when building one. Let's go back to the slideshow and open it up for questions. I'll hand it back over to Kiara.
Thank you, Joe. So there's actually a bit of a conversation going on in the Q&A. I'm worried that the chat might be disabled, which wasn't intentional. If you do have comments, you can put them in as questions, and that's fine. The first comment speaks to two different things. One thing that I think we were talking about before we started the webinar, when we were in the green room, about like the importance of validation in using LLMs. So the comment is, it seems that the automation testing of LLM is very brute force when we'll need a lot of validation cases. And I will say, if you can all see these comments and responses, Anuj, who replied, is part of the Tonic team, and he did mention that you can bulk upload benchmarks via the SDK using a JSON, and we're working on functionality to create synthetic benchmarks. But then there was another comment back around still needing to work on creating and maintaining the benchmarks. More effort now needs to be applied to QA. Joe, is there anything you'd like to comment on this back and forth?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing, it depends on like your use case and how your RAG system changes over time. But yeah, if you're going to have a benchmark with questions and reference correct answers, there's going to be some upfront cost to build that benchmark set. And then as Anu said, we're working on making some tooling to where we can build a benchmark set for you by prompting GPT-4 to come up with questions and correct answers. Another thing you can do is not all of the metrics in Tonic Validate need the reference correct answer to be used. So there's a bunch of metrics that just measure how good is the context, how does the context relate to the actual response from the RAG system? Does the response from the RAG system have information that's not taken from context? And so you can always use those metrics where you don't need a reference correct answer. So in that case, if you're like monitoring your RAG system and people, and maybe like they put the thumbs down answer, that's like a bad answer, you could collect those and then calculate the scores that don't need the reference correct answer on those, and try to understand why are you getting your thumbs downs on those questions. So that would be like a monitoring use case for Tonic Validate to see why are we answering these questions poorly.
Yeah. Thank you. I love this next question that came in. Can you guys speak on the production readiness of RAG-based applications? How should we be thinking about readiness?
I could take a crack. I think these AI assistants are still very good as like a sidekick. They're not really ready to be given control of things yet. So you will get a lot of answers that are imprecise, just like you will if you're using ChatGPT about public information. One of the things I put in Fireway that I think helps make the state-of-the-art production-ready solution is being able to tie answers back to the original reference material, so that, if you're skeptical of the advice you're getting from AI, you can go and see where it got that advice and interpret it for yourself and see maybe that's, not actually a relevant document. That said, there are also some things that if you're building, a RAG system or a system based on AI that I didn't touch upon that can also help harden it. ChatGPT in particular, or OpenAI, I should say, has the ability they have a feature called functions, where if you're using ChatGPT to like integrate systems, like if you wanted to provide a natural language interface as a control plane to some system that has an API where you would normally like program that system with a JSON document or something, you can use this functions feature to have ChatGPT answer with like JSON that meets a very specific spec, and it will 100% obey that spec. So if you're looking for precision functions as a thing to look into, I do think that the quality of LLM answers does not go down versus like when you're using RAG versus public answers, because there's been some key innovations there. Like GPT-4 with Turbo is now very fast. It's much cheaper, and it is really, really, really good versus where 3.5 was, even like 8 months ago. And the context lengths have gotten a lot longer. So if to you production ready means highly accurate answers, there's no replacement for displacement, so to speak, in that the best way to get more accurate answers is to have a larger context. You'll have to pay a little bit more, but the LLMs have gotten a lot faster and a lot cheaper, particularly with the high-end models, where that cost-benefit analysis might work out for you depending on your use case. So, like, things to keep in mind, make sure you understand what the costs would be of your RAG system. You can make a RAG system that's very, very, very good, but it could also be very expensive if you use that scale. So having a system that's transparent with respect to cost will help you make something that's production ready. Take advantage of functions if you're doing anything that requires machine-to-machine integration. I certainly would not try to create a production RAG system on which many people depend without a quick way to validate that the changes you make in trying to improve it don't sink the ship. And that's exactly what Tonic Validate does. I think it's suicide to try to build a RAG system on which many, many people depend without a tool like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just add a little bit to what Mark was saying, like piggyback off a couple of things is as far as like production readiness of RAG-based applications, just like with putting just a large language model into the wild, into production, like it depends on your use case and how the user is going to be interacting with your RAG-based application. And like one of the biggest values of a RAG-based application is that it does provide that retrieved context that's being used to answer the question. And so that is always a way to allow the person that's interacting with the application to see, the information where the answer is coming from. So I just added that is like one of the big values of putting a RAG-based application into production.
I'm just gonna put out, we're coming up on the end of the hour. So if you have a question, please don't be shy. Go ahead and ask it. We've got like 5 minutes left for questions. I've got one for both of you. While we wait for more questions to come in. How is RAG different from the Assistance API on ChatGPT?
Yeah, so ChatGPT, I guess, I don't know, maybe it was like 6 months ago or 4 months ago, something like that. They introduced their first kind of take on RAG, which is Assistance, where you could upload your own documents and build a custom GPT to answer questions on those documents. So you could control, I think, things like the user prompt, basically, and then what documents go into it. That is a very alpha quality solution, in my opinion. It's very not transparent. Like you can't even see how it is chunking or weighting the information in your documents. You can't see when you ask a question what documents were used or what the context length was. You can't make the trade-offs of speed versus accuracy. It could grow into something that is on par with a RAG system like Fireway or something that you could build yourself, but it is nowhere near there yet. And I don't know that they've done a ton of work in updating it since. Also, it doesn't have the ability to like crawl a document base like a website, a public website or a private website at all. I think it's basically just like uploading documents. So there's like kind of severe limitations on the size of the information repository that you can train it on.
Yeah, I would add that I think that the assistance feature is mostly used if people want to upload a few documents and ask questions about it. I don't think it's meant for huge scale. And then as far as evaluating it, because it doesn't give you the retrieved context that was used, and it's such a black box, it's really hard to evaluate how it's doing, and you can't make any changes to it because it's a black box. So I think it's probably a good solution if you're just you're chatting with ChatGPT and you just want to upload a couple of things real quick and see how it goes, but it doesn't scale at all.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I don't have any more questions in the Q&A, so I think we are good to wrap things up. If either of you have any last comments.
No, just want to thank everybody for attending. If anybody is interested on, doing a POC of Fireway on their own, internal systems, either on the website or with, an on-prem solution, please reach out. I'd be super interested in seeing if we can build something that works there.
Yeah, similarly, check out Tonic Validate. It's free to sign up for an account, and we're super interested in hearing anybody's feedback. And we're like rapidly developing it, and would love to like work with people who are using it. So, and thanks everyone for their time.
Awesome. Mark, I just want to make sure you saw that last comment that came through. Someone is interested in seeing and getting your pitch deck.
Absolutely. Kiara, feel free to send this along afterwards.
I will make sure that you guys connect.
Yep.
Great. All right. Yes. Echoing everyone. Can I get Mark's email again? The chat is disabled. Okay for me to just say mark@mockaroo.com. You can reach out to me.
Yeah. Or if you forget that, you can either go to Mockaroo or Fireway and just click the support button and it goes directly to me.
Yep. He is the genius behind it all. So you'll connect directly with him.
The one and only employee.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for the great questions along the way. Really helpful to help me even learn more about all this. And thank you, Mark and Joe. Really appreciate your time and all of your insight. Like they both said, please do sign up for Fireway and Tonic Validate. You've got the links right there. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kiara. See you later.